hand someone $50,000 in cash in a paper bag. No contract, no receipt, no camera. Then you come back later and ask a simple question. Where is the money? And instead of an answer, you get a lecture about process, a statement about integrity, and a conclusion that no wrongdoing was found. So let's be precise. Are we dealing with accountability? Or are we watching a system that has learned how to avoid it? This is not a normal hearing. This is a stress test of whether the United States government can still answer a basic question about its own money. Inside that room, Sheldon Whitehouse is not debating ideology. He is not speculating about intent. He is not even accusing anyone of a crime. He is doing something much more dangerous to a closed system. He is asking for a traceable fact. He locks the entire exchange onto one event. The FBI delivered $50,000 in cash in a paper bag to an associate. And he repeats, with surgical precision, what happened to the $50,000? Across from him, Pam Bondi does not answer that question. She reframes. She cites a completed investigation. She emphasizes that prosecutors and agents found no credible evidence of wrongdoing. But that is not the question. And Whitehouse makes that clear in real time. That was not my question. This is where the logic begins to fracture. Because no wrongdoing found is a legal conclusion, while where is the money is a factual inquiry. Those are not interchangeable. They do not cancel each other out. Yet in that exchange, they are being used as if one replaces the other. Now watch the structure. Whitehouse tightens the frame. He does not expand the debate, he narrows it. Did the FBI get the money back? Did the recipient keep it? If he kept it, was it declared on tax returns? These are not rhetorical questions. These are audit questions. Each one points to a document, a record, a line item that either exists or does not exist. This is what prosecutorial logic looks like. Step 1. Establish the transaction. Step 2. Track custody. Step 3. Verify disclosure. Clean. Sequential. Verifiable. And yet the answers never land on that sequence. Instead, the response drifts. It pivots to unrelated talking points. It introduces political counterattacks. It challenges the premise without directly denying it. What you are watching is not confusion. It is a pattern. When a system cannot deny a fact, it dilutes the question. When it cannot explain a transaction, it replaces the transaction with a narrative. And when it cannot produce a record, it produces distance. Let's translate this into everyday terms. If a private company handed out $50,000 in cash and could not later account for its location, that would trigger an internal audit within hours. If a bank employee responded to that question with, "We found no wrongdoing," without showing where the money went, that would not end the inquiry. It would escalate it. Because the absence of a crime is not proof of control, and control of funds is the baseline expectation, not the optional extra. So when Whitehouse repeats the question, and he does repeat it deliberately, you are not hearing redundancy. You are hearing pressure. Controlled, methodical pressure. Because every time the question is asked and not answered, the gap becomes clearer, not louder. Clearer. And in a courtroom, clarity is where cases are built. But here is where the hearing stops being about one transaction and starts revealing a system behavior. Because once Sheldon Whitehouse establishes the first gap, $50,000 delivered, no clear accounting, he does not stop. He expands the scope, not by changing the subject, but by applying the same logic to a larger dataset. And that dataset has a name: Suspicious Activity Reports, or SARs, automatically generated by the Treasury and routed to the Department of Justice. Hundreds of them tied to accounts associated with Jeffrey Epstein. Hundreds of alerts that, by definition, signal potential financial irregularities. And the question, again, is brutally simple. How many of those reports were actually investigated? Not summarized. Not acknowledged. Investigated. Because a SAR is not a headline, it is a trigger. It exists to force action. If you receive hundreds of triggers and act on none, that is not backlog. That is a breakdown. And when Whitehouse presses that point, what comes back is not a number, not a percentage, not even an estimate. It is deflection. Now step into prosecutorial mode. Stack the evidence. We have a documented cash transfer, $50,000, delivered by a federal agency. We have no confirmed chain of custody after delivery. We have follow-up questions about whether the funds were returned or reported, unanswered. Then we have a second layer. Hundreds of SARs tied to high-risk financial activity, with no clear investigative footprint. These are not isolated anomalies. These are parallel failures in the same system, tracking money and acting on red flags. And here is the contradiction that matters. On one hand, the response from Pam Bondi leans heavily on the phrase, full review, and no credible evidence of wrongdoing. On the other hand, when asked for the underlying mechanics, where the money went, which reports were investigated, there is no disclosure. That creates a logical inversion. A full review without traceable outputs is not verification. It is a claim. And in any investigative framework, claims without supporting records do not close a case, they open one. Watch how the exchange shifts again. Instead of addressing the SARs, the response pivots to personal associations, to alleged political ties, to funding sources. This is not accidental. It is a classic displacement technique. Move the audience away from the dataset and toward the individual asking the question. But the dataset does not disappear. The reports still exist. The money still moved. The only thing that changes is where the attention goes. And that is the point. Now bring it back to structure. In a functioning accountability system, data triggers action, action generates records, and records answer questions. Here, the chain breaks at step 2. Data exists. Questions are asked. But the action, and more importantly, the documentation of that action, remains opaque. And when opacity becomes the default response, I can't discuss that, stops being a legal boundary and starts becoming a shield. And this is where the pressure builds. Because Whitehouse is not asking for classified intelligence. He is not asking for strategy. He is asking for outcomes. Did the money return? Were the reports investigated? These are binary endpoints, yes or no. And every time the answer avoids that binary, the gap widens. Not emotionally, structurally. Because a system that cannot confirm its own financial trail is not neutral. It is unstable. And then the hearing crosses a line. From a question about missing money into a question about controlled silence. Because now the focus shifts to testimony, to records that exist but cannot be seen. Kash Patel tells the committee his grand jury testimony, after immunity, after initially pleading the Fifth, was sealed by the Department of Justice. That is not a rumor. That is a statement on record. And the follow-up question is immediate. Who sealed it, when, and why? Again, the answer does not come. Not a timeline, not a procedural explanation, just a refusal to engage. I'm not going to discuss that. And here is where the logic tightens even further. Because sealing testimony is not unusual in itself. Grand jury proceedings are often protected. But this is not a question about legality. It is a question about consistency. If a witness claims the testimony exists, claims it was sealed, and even claims an effort to release it publicly, then the Department of Justice is no longer a bystander. It is a participant, and participants leave records, orders, filings, authorizations. None of that is addressed. Now layer that onto what we already have, a cash transaction with no confirmed endpoint, hundreds of suspicious activity reports with no disclosed investigative outcome, and now testimony that may contain critical context, locked behind procedural silence. This is not one gap. This is a structure of gaps. Different categories, same pattern. Data exists, but access is restricted. Actions may have occurred, but documentation is withheld. Questions are asked, but answers are deferred. And then comes the third layer. Internal accountability. Whitehouse raises the issue of an Office of Professional Responsibility investigation, potential prosecutorial misconduct tied to individuals involved in the same network of events. This is not external oversight. This is the system auditing itself. And the question is again precise. Does the investigation exist? And if it concluded, is there a summary? That is standard practice. OPR routinely acknowledges investigations and issues summaries at the end. That is not classified doctrine. That is baseline transparency, but the response is the same wall. I'm not going to discuss personnel matters, even public ones, even procedural ones, even the existence of an investigation. And this is where the contradiction sharpens into something unavoidable. Because you cannot simultaneously claim a system is functioning properly while refusing to confirm whether its internal accountability mechanisms are even active. That is not protection of process. That is insulation from scrutiny. Now translate this into a real-world image. You are told a company ran a full internal audit. You are told no wrongdoing was found. You ask to see the audit summary. You are told that is a personnel matter. You ask whether the audit even took place. You are told that cannot be discussed. At that point, the question is no longer about the audit. It is about whether the audit exists in any meaningful, verifiable form. This is the moral inflection point, because the victim here is not a single individual. It is the public's ability to trust the system that handles their money, their laws, their enforcement. When $50,000 cannot be tracked, when hundreds of financial alerts do not translate into visible action, when testimony is sealed without explanation, and when internal investigations cannot be confirmed, what you are left with is not uncertainty. It is a pattern of controlled opacity. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Opacity is not neutral. It benefits someone. It protects something. The question is not whether information exists. It clearly does. The question is who controls access to it, and under what conditions that access is denied. And this is where the hearing stops being about individuals and becomes a referendum on the system itself. Because at this point, the pattern is no longer debatable. A documented $50,000 cash transfer with no confirmed endpoint. Hundreds of suspicious activity reports tied to Jeffrey Epstein with no disclosed investigative outcomes. Testimony from Kash Patel that is acknowledged, then sealed, then shielded from explanation. And an internal accountability mechanism that cannot even be confirmed to exist in public form. This is not a gap. This is architecture. Now step back and look at what that architecture does. It does not deny facts. It absorbs them. It does not refute questions. It outlasts them. Because every time Sheldon Whitehouse asks, "Where is the money?" the answer is not here or there. The answer is delay, deflection, and distance. And over time, that becomes a system feature, not a bug. A system where answers are technically possible, but operationally unreachable. This is where moral contrast becomes unavoidable. On one side, you have the public, people who pay taxes, who follow reporting rules, who cannot move $10,000 without triggering a bank report, who are audited, documented, tracked. On the other side, you have a federal transaction, $50,000 in cash, delivered in a paper bag, where the chain of custody dissolves into procedural fog. That contrast is not theoretical. It is structural. The rules are precise at the bottom and flexible at the top. And this is the moment where the meaning of the hearing becomes clear. This is not about Democrats versus Republicans. It is not about personalities. It is about whether the rule of law is symmetrical. Because if the system can track every dollar when it moves through ordinary citizens, but cannot, or will not, track a federal cash payment when questioned in a public hearing, then the issue is not complexity. The issue is selectivity. Let's translate that into plain terms. If the answer to "where is the money" depends on who is asking or who is involved, then the system is not blind. It is calibrated. And once a system becomes calibrated around power instead of principle, accountability becomes optional, not abolished, not denied, just optional. And optional accountability is not accountability at all. Now return to the central question, because it never changed. It was never complicated. It was never abstract. It was always this. The FBI delivered $50,000 in cash. What happened to it? Did it come back? Was it kept? Was it reported? Yes or no? And after all the statements, all the references to investigations, all the procedural shields, that question still sits there, unanswered. So here is the real question for you, not for the hearing room. If a system cannot produce a clear answer about its own money, in its own proceeding, on the record, what else exists inside that same system that cannot be traced, cannot be verified, and cannot be challenged? And more importantly, are you comfortable with that? Because this is where you come in. If you believe accountability should be simple, visible, and equal, then don't let this question disappear the way the answer did. Hit like if you think the public deserves a clear answer. Drop a comment. Where do you think the line is between process and avoidance? Share this so more people can see what was asked and what was never answered. And subscribe for more breakdowns where the noise is stripped away and the record speaks for itself.